ايه صح. اوكي. صباح الخير. نحن حنبدأ بعد دقيقتين على القد، ناطرين المتروقين والمتروقات ينزلوا. طيب، صباح الخير جميعا وأهلا وسهلا فيكم بالجلسة الافتتاحية أو الكلمة المفتاحية الثانية اليوم. أنا كتير سعيدة وبشرفني أن أكون عم دير هيدي الجلسة اليوم مع زميلتين وصديقتين عزيزتين، الأستاذة الدكتورة جوال أبي راشد، وطبعا الدكتورة حنان السبع رح تكون رح تكون المناقشة لهيدي الجلسة. جلستنا اليوم عن موضوع مهم كتير وطبعا مرتبط يعني عنوان الأكبر للمؤتمر، والترجمة بالعربي لكلمة يلي جويل كويند، أماكن الصدمات أرشفت الجراح ومدن الدمار. رح أقدم جويل سريعا، والترجمة هي ترجمتي فأعذروا أي خطأ. جوال هي أستاذة في الطب في الجامعة الأمريكية في بيروت، وملتحقة في كلية التاريخ وعلوم الآثار الأركيولوجي، كما أنها ملتحقة أيضا بكلية أو قسم تاريخ العلوم في جامعة هارفارد. هي المديرة المؤسسة لبرنامج التاريخ الطبي الأخلاقيات والسياسات في الAUB في الجامعة الأمريكية ببيروت، ولها العديد من الإصدارات العلمية والإصدارات يعني بمجلات الغير علمية والمهمة جدا، وأدعو الجميع إلى الاطلاع عليها. ومن أهمها وأحبها على قلبي هو كتاب بعنوان العصفورية: تاريخ الجنون، الحداثة والحرب في الشرق الأوسط. بظن نحن اليوم كتير محظوظين بهيدي الجلسة وبوجود جوال معنا، ورح يعني رح نستمع لندوة أو لتوك مثيرة جدا للتفكير والنقاش. بعد تقديم جوال رح تكون المتحدثة معنا الدكتورة حنان السبع، يلي هي كمان صديقة عزيزة، وهي أستاذة في الأنثروبولوجيا ومحررة مجلة بحوث القاهرة كايرو بيبرز في العلوم الاجتماعية في الجامعة الأمريكية في القاهرة AUC، وتتمركز أبحاثها حول الزمنية والأرض والعمل في أفريقيا، العلاقات ما بين الدولة والأفراد، وصناعة السرديات التاريخية، خاصة بما يتعلق بسردية تجربة التحولات الثورية والمخيال السياسي للنضالات من أجل التغيير. بهذا المعنى أبحاثها تحاكي الأنثروبولوجيا والتاريخ والاقتصاد السياسي. وطبعا دكتورة حنان لها الكثير من الإصدارات اللي تعلمت أنا منها كثير، ويلي بعدنا بنتعلم منها. فشكرا كثير لوجودكم اثنيناتكم معنا. رح نفتتح الجلسة رح نفتتح الندوة بتوك جوال. شكرا كثير.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, in the back? Yes? Okay. Thank you so much for this generous introduction, Rima. I'm very impressed with your Arabic and the fluency of your Arabic. And I thank the Arab Council for the Social Sciences for the invitation to speak to you today. And I thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. I know it's a bit painful, so I'm very appreciative. And I apologize for delivering this address, this keynote address in English, although it is my third language, and it is a third language for many Lebanese among us in this room and beyond. It has been holding in recent years a curious grip on my working memory, which I'm sure deserves a psychoanalytic explanation, but I would not venture into that this morning. In any case, this is ironic because the devastation at Damar that I'll be talking about unfolds in a setting which is far more familiar in Arabic and in the various dialects around this region, right, including Lebanese. Now, when I think of destruction, which is one of the pillars, one of the key themes of this conference, I recall my own experiences. This is inevitable, and many of which may be familiar to some of you, and which I have compiled under this first overarching theme of archives, and I'm going to say why in a bit. I remember our house exploding in 1990. I must have been around 9, because militia ammunition had been stored nearby carelessly and irresponsibly. I think of the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon, and my escape to Paris via Damascus, a city I had never visited before, and of the endless scenes of wounded landscapes along the way, some eerily mingled with archaeological ruins. I remember fleeing to Cyprus as a child. I must have been around 9, aboard a ship crowded with thousands of other Lebanese refugees. We were refugees, although we were in denial, as many Lebanese are. Apparently, we were even called the New Boat People. This is an article from the New York Times. Because like the Vietnamese before us, we had fled by sea to safer shores. I recall the many political assassinations that have plagued Lebanon and punctuated my university years. I remember the Beirut port explosion that devastated the city and claimed so many senseless lives. And of course, we all remember the recent war, which killed more than 4,000 people, wounded more than 16,000, displaced over 1 million people, and traumatized an entire population through its relentless psychological warfare, bombardment and destruction, and so on, right? The list seems endless. This is a piece of my archives of memory, but I'm sure each one of you have their own compilation of archival memories of trauma and traumatic moments. Now, in her powerful and influential book, Archives of Feeling, Anne Shvektovich asks, what if we treated affect, in other words, feelings, moods, and embodied memory, as a kind of archive? And how can we imagine healing and political resistance through these emotional and cultural forms? Now, interestingly, I think that the latter question is answered less by examining how communities survive and record loss, and more by exploring how trauma shapes memory and imagination, and how expressing that trauma or deciding not to express it becomes an act of survival. And this is what my talk is about today. Drawing on the idea of an archive for our affects, of our wounded selves and traumatized psyches, I want to argue that destruction itself creates different kinds of archives. An archive of erasure, an archive of traces, a landscape of cities that need to be archived, and archives of affected selves. All of this suggests that our brains, with their immense capacity to comprehend destruction, conceptualize it, overcome it, catalog it, and reimagine it, testify to the power of imagination. And this is the second pillar of this conference. Imagination is a faculty that is profoundly paradoxical, and I'm sure most of you would agree with this statement. As Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer argued most famously in their dialectic of enlightenment, it is that same instrumental reason that fuels both scientific and technological progress and cultivates the imagination of domination, laying the groundwork for mass destruction under late capitalism. But to return to the topographical archives of destruction and affect, for me, this is most poignantly illustrated by the devastation of hospitals in Gaza. Their destruction is not only a nihilistic, perverse military strategy of domination and total annihilation. This strategy of destroying the morale of civilians has always been a strategy of powerful armies since the invention of the warplane. But I think more pertinently and revealingly, the destruction of hospitals is a destruction of something more than just the morale of a population. It's a destruction of archives of care. It's a destruction of archives of networks of solidarity and compassion, of patient stories of empathy, of mundane suffering and hope. It's a destruction of the archives of injuries that record the nature of a changing warfare and its moral dimensions. In other words, it's a destruction of the evidence of the crime itself. Without records, without spaces, without witnesses, it becomes easier to deny atrocities and harder for communities to reclaim their past. Medical institutions, in specific, are repositories of stories of healing, of solidarity, of survival, of testimony, but also of our moral values, of our human values. When they are destroyed, it is not just the infrastructure that vanishes, it is an entire layer of history and social fabric that vanishes. This is why clinics and hospitals have become and should become informal archives of war. And doctors, as we have seen during this genocidal war on Gaza, have become the new chroniclers of the new patterns of injuries, of the types of weapons used, of the condition of the bodies shattered by these new weapons, of stories untold, of the decay of morality. I was about to say of the collapse of morality. In situations like these, we often feel helpless and hopeless, if not outright defeated. And there is a sense of defeat in the air, right? A feel of defeat in the air. And there is a name for the response we experience when faced with senseless violence: the maiming of children, the killing of poets and intellectuals, the torture of physicians. I think it is not simply horror, shock, sadma, or even collective trauma. It is what I call moral insult. Now, the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, I don't know if any of you have heard about him, introduced the related concept of moral injury in his seminal 1994 book, Achilles in Vietnam. And so he draws on Homer's Iliad, which is a classic in ancient Greek literature, a canon in Western literature, to show how soldiers can suffer a betrayal of what is right. And this is a wound that reaches far beyond the conventional post-traumatic stress disorder, that is described in psychiatric texts and so on. His notion of moral injury captures the uniquely ethical damage of war. These are harms that are inflicted by legitimate authority, in this case, in the case of soldiers, that violate one's deepest moral convictions. This is what he calls moral injury. Now, my own choice of a relevant Greek tragedy or an analogy to a Greek tragedy would be not Achilles, right? Not Homer's Iliad, but Euripides' Trojan War, which centers not on a hero. It doesn't center on Achilles, the hero, but ordinary women devastated by war, devastated by the betrayal in the promise of a just society and a just future, and a betrayal of morality and the collapse of the moral order. This is what I call moral insult, by which I mean, more specifically, the shattering of one's belief in a shared common framework of common values, what we call today human rights. It is this kind of moral insult, more than anything else really, that drives us today, I think, into a despair beyond repair and into cynicism. Yet, in this abyss of despair, we can glimpse the full depth of the wound. The human tragedy of a society so entranced, I was about to say a world so entranced by violence, that it slaughters its innocence. And this brings me to the third theme of the conference that I would like to address, and it has to do with self-knowledge and critical knowledge. And this is echoed, I think, in the story of Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac when, at God's command, he raises the knife only to be stopped at the last moment. There is another story in the Bible which is equally powerful and insightful. It's a passage in the Gospel of Matthew that describes how the King Herod, the king of Judea, ordered the slaughter of all male children of Bethlehem. This is known as the massacre of innocents. And this theme has been a powerful subject in Western art from the Renaissance through the Baroque period, inspiring many artists to convey over centuries both the biblical narrative and their own era's anxieties vis-à-vis the slaughter of the innocent that kept changing over the centuries. And yet this gesture to universalize the atrocity, transforming a biblical story into reflections on political violence, communal trauma, and the enduring horror of child slaughter, is today confined to museums and to aesthetic contemplations. We have banalized and normalized the massacre of innocents. Most of us are no longer even moved by its artistic representations, though some still contemplate such scenes in museums with genuine dismay. Others still prefer to look away, right, overwhelmed by live images of beheaded children. Some can conjure the violence in their mind without watching every single image of a slaughtered kid or every single image of a starved kid. And this is precisely, by the way, what artists and art does in the representation of violence. It asks us to imagine the next act in this act of violence. I remember even colleagues last year who insisted they could no longer bear to see photographs of mutilated children in Gaza. And I thought how convenient it is to look away, until I asked myself whether I too had grown numb to what unsettles them. That, I realized, is how we aestheticize violence, by confining a torrent of disturbing images within the safe borders of a frame. And yet, the massacre of innocents and its representation in Western art, and not only now Western art, this is a superb representation of Sabra and Shatila massacre by the Iraqi artist Al-Azzawi, which is at the Tate in London, illustrate the core of my argument today, that the trauma of violence creates new avenues for reinventing our human condition. And this is the paradox. This is akin to what the economist Schumpeter calls creative destruction. And I'm sure some of you have heard about it. The process by which the old economic order is incessantly destroyed and replaced by new innovations. A dynamic he attributes to capitalism, which is, a system, according to him, that, well, devours and kills, literally sometimes, but this is now how he put it, and yet constantly reinvents itself. So it feeds on destruction. One might similarly contend that the destruction of cities, and with it the emergence of our wounded selves, paradoxically opens spaces for reimagining new ways of being in the world. So our place, new ways of reflecting about our place in this universe. And I'm not saying that the process is easy or straightforward. It is, painless, but it is painful. It is not painless. But without destruction, imagination cannot take root, ironically and paradoxically enough. I don't know if you've watched this classic film noir from 1949, but there's a very famous line by Harry Lime, who's the antagonist in this mystery thriller published in 1949. Actually, it's a film noir. It was not a book. And this is what he says. You know what the fellow said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare terror, murder, and bloodshed. And they produce Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did they produce? The cuckoo clock. Now, before my mother passed away from cancer 3 years ago, she confirmed to my astonishment a recurrent dream I have been having of a narrow corridor in our old house with me squatting between her, my grandmother, and my aunt. And I remember the unbearable sounds of bombs and the shattering of the window glasses. I remember a yellow hue. I remember screams. I remember the prayers. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old. And the distressing image was recurring recently, perhaps because, as a friend casually suggested over coffee, the shattering of the home, this idyllic, safe, idyllic space of our most intimate lives, was breaking down as an omen to my mother's own impending death and the erosion of her own body. After all, as Carl Jung wrote, dreams are the guiding words of the soul. You see, children remember what happens to them. Traumatic memories are the most consolidated form of memories. They are indelible, they are visceral, they are haunting imprints etched into the very fabric of our consciousness and our subconsciousness. Unlike ordinary memories, these memories are characterized by their intensity and sometimes emotional distress they evoke, precisely because they stem from life-threatening events. But traumatic memories are not confined to the past, and this is their characteristic. They infiltrate the present. Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer characterized these intrusive thoughts as quote-unquote foreign bodies. For a long time, in fact, philosophers and psychologists have highlighted this quote-unquote presentist experience of memory. And indeed, a recent study in Nature Neuroscience suggests that traumatic memories are processed as present experience. While we can think retrospectively of the origin of trauma as far back in time, as described in Genesis with Adam and Eve disobeying God's command, the idea of a traumatic memory or of a psychological trauma, in fact, emerges only in the 19th century. Now, this is somewhat surprising because trauma, or trauma, as the Greeks called it, is a very old term. And of course, mental or psychological ailments, be they grief, melancholia, mania, and so on, are as old as humanity. The Bible is saturated with a wide range of human emotions: anger, jealousy, greed, sadness, rage, anguish, and so on. And we saw how the Greek tragedy itself is infused with such emotions. The panoply of human distress is rich and terrifying. David grappled with despondency. Elijah felt disheartened and overwhelmed. Job experienced sorrow, bereavement, and sickness. And yet, prior to the 19th century, trauma did not refer to a psychological state of mind or a mental wound, as we moderns or heirs to modernity and postmodernity assume it to mean. Both Hippocrates and Galen, the great Greek physicians, spoke of trauma as a breach or discontinuity of the skin from the flesh. It was very physical as a concept. Or, as Galen recognized it, a dissolution of continuity. It was literally a puncture in the flesh, in the blood vessels. But a new psychological literature started to emerge with the technologies of modernity of the 19th century, more specifically the railway. As steam locomotives hurtled across the countryside in Europe, right, terrifying crashes and derailments became grim spectacles of industrial power gone awry. physicians and writers started to document peculiar new forms of quote unquote neurosis among survivors and witnesses, such as trembling fits or nightmares of collapsing tracks and an overwhelming fear of motion itself. They called it railway neurosis. And this neurosis, this new neurosis, marked one of the first clinical recognitions of trauma induced not by battle, but by the technologies of progress. By the late 19th century, psychologists and other mental specialists were all writing about repressed or suppressed memories of a shock that now transcended railways and railway accidents to include banal, mundane events of everyday life, and that left an indelible mark on consciousness. William James called these psychic disturbances, quote unquote, thorns in the spirit, while the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot and his student Pierre Janet opted for parasites in the spirit. By the end of the 19th century, trauma had been psychologized to the extent that one could read in a regular magazine that psychic trauma is a morbid nervous disorder. Now, the anthropologist Alan Young had suggested a double genealogy for the concept of trauma. He suggested that on the one hand, there is a physical, or shall we say a somatic genealogy that goes back to the Greeks, as I mentioned, and continues to this day with the persistence of the definition in, for example, surgical concept of traumatism. But there is also a psychological genealogy with the birth of the traumatic psychological wounds of the 19th century, related first, as I mentioned, to injuries of the spine from the railway accidents, and then to injuries to the soul or mind with no physical sequelae or correlates. So this is the double genealogy that the anthropologist Alan Young mentioned. Now, I'd like to add a third dimension to the genealogy of trauma, and that's its spatial or topological dimension. Now, space refers to form, to the material dimension, and to the site itself, the place, amakin, right, or places. This is why I propose a history of sites of trauma, what I call, with this new neologism, traumatopias. Amakin is sadma, right? From the Greek trauma, which means wound, literally, and topos, another Greek term, which means place. In other words, I'm suggesting to reconceptualize the history of trauma as the history of places and spaces marked by trauma. Now, interestingly, the Latin word spatium, from which space derives, includes the notion of time. It originally meant an arena, an extent, but also duration. The French philosopher Henri Bergson famously distinguished durée, what he calls durée. This is a qualitative lived time that each one of us lives, from the homogeneous quantitative time measured by clocks, which he calls duration. I'd like to argue that traumatopias similarly distinguish between the lived time of the wounded self and the broader historical time of an event, whether this is a massacre, the destruction of a hospital, the sack of a city, an earthquake, and so on. And the personal intergenerational transmission of that rupture across time and space. Now, this spatial dimension is captured by the Greek notion of topos, which Aristotle defines in physics as the innermost motionless boundary of whatever contains it. For the topography of traumatopias that I'm suggesting, I propose using topos to include the wounded body itself, and this maintains the Greek meaning of a wound with its scars and its stigmata, as well as the invisible realm of wounded souls. Topos, or topoi in the plural, also denotes the sites where the traumatic discourse takes place and takes shape. The battlefields, but also the private homes, colonies and plantations, factories of mass culture and consumption, clinics and hospitals, workplaces and other sites of capitalist production. Some of these places, as you may have noticed, are public, others are private. Some are enclosed, others are open fields. Some are normative and disciplinary in nature, as Michel Foucault famously described them, and others contest these ordinary social orders. They contest these disciplinary social orders, and you can consider them more ordinary. This is what I meant. So traumatopias are at once physical and moral, material and imaginary. They span the West and the rest, from imperial centers and epicenters to peripheries. Unlike utopias that are ideal but unreal, traumatopias are real. They reflect an infinite number of possible stories of real experiences of violence. They resist any simple ordering of time or meaning. They are neither safe havens nor static memorials. They unfold as contested terrains where memory and erasure, where testimony and silence continuously collide. In these spaces, the past ruptures the present and demands that we bear witness to violence, not as a distant fiction, but as an ongoing site of ethical and political engagement. In his 1999 essay on the natural history of destruction, the German writer W.G. Sebald deliberately evokes the traditions of scientific cataloging. Think of 18th and 19th century naturalists who document plants, animals, or geological phenomena. And he applies them instead to the phenomenon of wartime destruction and devastation. In his opening essay, he treats the Allied bombardment of German cities, during which 131 towns were flattened, some almost entirely erased, as if it were a species long overlooked by cultural historians. By framing destruction this way, Sebald underscores both its impersonal force and the silence that surrounded it in post-war German literature and collective memory. Moreover, the natural history metaphor, so a natural history of destruction, serves a second purpose. It highlights the archival traces of violence, the ruined buildings, the photographs, eyewitness accounts, as specimens that demand careful observation and moral reckoning. Sebald shows how these remnants become a kind of palimpsest where layers of trauma, of guilt, of denial, and repression accumulate beneath the surface of everyday life, yet remain largely unexamined in German's post-war economic miracle narrative. His work thus reads destruction not merely as a political or ideological event, but as a landscape to be surveyed, inviting readers to break the cultural taboo of forgetting. But one might ask, right, where is the wounded self in this ruined landscape? Sebald speaks of experiences of collective uprooting, of despair, of internalized guilt that has resurfaced in recent years, as we saw, of fragments of remembrance, and of a deep and systemic silence, perhaps because, as Sebald writes, and I'm quoting here, such fragmentary memories show that it is impossible to gauge the depth of trauma suffered by those who came away from the epicenters of catastrophe, unquote. Now I'm moving towards the epilogue of my reflection. The term cities of destruction was introduced by a sociologist called E. Franklin Fraser in his seminal 1939 work, The Negro Family in the United States. In the section titled In the City of Destruction, Fraser examined the profound challenges faced by African American families who migrated from the rural South, which one might consider, a traumatopia par excellence, to urban centers in the North. And he argued that these families often encountered environments marked by poverty, racial segregation, and the erosion of communal institutions, which led to the disintegration of traditional family structures and social cohesion. His concept of a city of destruction, or the city of destruction, highlights how systemic inequalities and urban conditions contribute to the marginalization and destabilization of Black communities. In his 1963 essay, My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew, James Baldwin referenced Fraser's cities of destruction to describe the oppressive environments that young Black individuals, like his nephew, were born into. He warned that internalizing the negative perceptions imposed by a racially unjust society could lead to personal destruction. Now, you might call it historical trauma, others might call it intergenerational trauma, but the link is very clearly established here. And what is clear is that cities of devastation have not only bred profound displacement, fragmentation, and one might say psychological ruin, but have also served as crucibles for renewal, transformation, and rebirth, though the traces of devastation remain ominous. Baldwin's letter to his nephew ends by quoting a traditional spiritual. It goes like this: "The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off." Basically, he was telling his nephew that love and self-love and self-knowledge, rather than self-love, can break the nation's racial dungeon. Hope is not sentimental for Baldwin, but an act of resistance, always tethered to truth-telling and to struggle. As he would put it, hope is a moral obligation forged in fire, blood, and anguish. So this brings me now to whether we can speak of trauma after Gaza. And I began reflecting on this concept of traumatopias long before the war on Gaza erupted. Then October 7 happened. The horror of that day and the even greater horror that followed continue to haunt me. And I can only ask now, what would trauma after Gaza look like? What shape does this discourse take? And how might we begin to make sense of it all? As Pankaj Mishra rightly argues in his recently brilliant and bold book, The World After Gaza, Gaza will mark, I think, a major rupture in modern history. For me, Gaza's landscape of devastation makes the inquiry into traumatopias all the more urgent, and it brings into sharp relief the stakes at play and clarifies the state of our world. And one of them, for me, is the hierarchy of human lives. Now, the Latin phrase, ordo amoris, literally means the order of love or the ordering of one's affections. And it is Augustine of Hippo, Saint Augustine, right, who was one of the first to reflect more seriously and systematically on how loving the right things in the right order is essential to moral life. And I'm mentioning this because we see today a perverted ordo amoris, a hierarchy of affect, love of one's family and neighbors and fellow citizens of a country before strangers and foreigners, which is not at all what the fathers of the church meant by ordo amoris, as the late Pope Francis reminded J.P. Vance, the American vice president, who invoked St. Augustine's Ordo Amoris to justify President Trump's policy towards migrants and immigrants. In his remarkable letter to the US bishops on February 10th, and I really encourage you to read it, it's not very long, and this was published 2 months and 1 week before he passed away, Pope Francis reminded the bishops, so he felt the need to remind the bishops that, and I'm quoting him, the true Ordo Amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception, unquote. I personally find Vance's reordering of love and affect, and that's without mentioning the instrumentalization, right, of theology, privileging tribal bonds over compassion for strangers, deeply disturbing. And of course, I'm not arguing here from a theological perspective. So theologians have weighed in, the Pope himself has weighed in, and showed how deeply wrong and instrumentalist this interpretation is. Now, you might say this is normal, right? Prioritizing one's family is natural. After all, as the proverb goes, charity begins at home. But it contradicts, after all, the essence of caritas, which demands universal solidarity and which is a core tenet, a core ethics in Christian theology, just to mention that kind of theology. But I think more pertinently for me, in this distorted hierarchy of affects, the psychological devastation of the powerless, of the marginalized, of the poor, of the persecuted, of the silenced, are systematically discounted and delegitimized. Such selectivity constitutes an imperial logic of trauma. So even in suffering, there is a hierarchy of who is allowed to suffer and who is not, who is worthy of suffering and who is not. And that I find deeply disturbing. To speak of trauma after Gaza, I think demands a reappraisal of the entire discourse on trauma. It means reimagining ourselves with our new wounds, including the moral insult I mentioned earlier. But it also means reclaiming knowledge. It means becoming chroniclers of forms of violence that are weaponized for political and ideological ends. It means historicizing these affects before it is too late. Trauma after Gaza means recognizing Gaza as the defining rupture of the 21st century, much like the Holocaust, tragically enough, was for the 20th. It's a moral, intellectual, aesthetic, artistic, and conceptual abyss that we're in, and that forces us to confront who we are, how we value human life, and how shattered lives might begin to reimagine, rebuild, revisit, reweave, literally restitch or resuture themselves. These remarks are only the starting point for a broader reflection I'm developing on how the utopia we were promised as children and then as adults by our parents, by our leaders, by our politicians, and even by God, for those of us who believe, can transform into a landscape of endless traumatic encounters. And this is what I mean by traumatopia. Thank you very much for your attention.
شكرا كثير جوال على الجولة الفكرية والتاريخية من يعني تاريخ المفاهيم لطرح مفاهيم جديدة وربط الماضي بالحاضر والتفكير بزمننا الأليم اليوم. ويمكن حاجة يعني إنه نلاقي مفاهيم جديدة لتفسير هذا الواقع والتعامل معه. مش أنا المتحدثة فرح رح خلي حنان هلا تعقب على اللي سمعناه، وبعدين بنفتح ناخذ كم سؤال من الجمهور.
شكرا كتير جوال على البيبر والبرزنتيشن اللي بتطرح علينا عدد من الأسئلة أساسية للمرحلة واللحظة. وأعتقد إن هي جزء أساسي من إحنا جايين هنا بنعمل اليومين دول. أنا هتكلم بالإنجلش علشان البرزنتيشن كانت بالإنجلش، وأحب إن أنا أفتح حوار مع جوال ف نلعب اللعبة. أعتقد what I want to do is to start actually from the end, from where Joelle started, with our categories and how do we deal with them. Over the last few years, we have heard trauma iterated in these rooms several times. And I kept on wondering, is this all that we can do using Wendy Brown's To Think With? Is trauma actually capable at this very particular moment, and as Joelle had described, after Gaza, Mishra's book, is trauma possible to unpack for us and to help us think? Because all that we can hope for is to be able to take this moment to revisit the key categories with which we have done what we have done in an attempt to engage, understand, interpret, and make possible a living. Joelle proposed for us a history of the category itself, both somatic and psychological. How did we get there? And the 19th century playing a critical moment in really creating trauma as a category, medicalized, socialized, psychologized, treated, etc. And she proposed topia, or topo, space particularly, and the affected body as critical to an understanding of trauma. And one iteration about topos is use that, for instance, Johannes Fabian, an anthropologist, deployed in his attempt to talk about how did imperial powers, particularly within the context of Africa, create processes of dehumanization that were premised precisely in making it, quote unquote, impossible to think of people of black spin, Africans, as equivalent, same time, same race, same humanity, same species, so to speak. And one of the ways through which this happened was stories about cannibalism, whereby they acted as topos, meaning they are everywhere, but actually nowhere. Are we seeing the inversion with Gaza, Palestine, Al-Daffa, along with all the other places in the Arab world and beyond, that have witnessed seriously an attempt that recalls for us what Yassin al-Hajj Saleh 2 years ago sat on this precise place and talked about what does it mean to stare in the face of al-faziyah, al-horrible? What does it mean to think the possible and the impossible? And what does it mean to actually engage with the familiar in that sense? Is Gaza a topo? Everywhere we see it, we hear it. For those who want to see and hear, by the way. And for others, it is the nowhere. We cannot find it. To the extent that the moral injury and the moral insult reached a stage whereby Donald Trump yesterday, in an interview, talked about Gaza as a freedom zone. Freedom zone. This is not only a moral insult or a moral injury. It actually tells us that it is nowhere. Nowhere as an imagination to imagine that the Palestinians and Palestine are actually people. Not only numbers. People that have been devastated, but we cannot think of them as on par with the rest. Freedom zone in Gaza that is premised actually on, quote unquote, in the same sentence, he can argue. It is a place of hell. But we never actually ask, okay, if you admit that it is a place of hell, where is the hell coming from? How come the iteration of a genocide, of total destruction, is an impossibility in the case of Gaza? And here I'm following also something that, again, this week I think was very, very interesting. Nadia Abu Hajj, in the Bisan lectures on Wednesday night, argued that precisely it is the impossibility to think of the Palestinian as a victim, because it is always premised on the idea that the Palestinian, quote unquote, is a terror, is a fighter, is a resisting force. And hence the child that we see mutilated becomes a potentiality of a future whereby literally that has to be annihilated. It cannot be innocence. So the massacre of the innocence does not work. It makes it a nowhere in that sense. So what I'm inviting you to think with in that sense is, A, does trauma actually does the work that we hope it does? Or are we precisely after Gaza, for the nth time, we are in need to actually revisit the categories and to revisit also the moral injuries of what we have believed and desire to believe at some moment as, quote unquote, common values. Whose common and whose values? Why are we so astonished? While time and again, we have been told, lived, felt on our bodies that we actually are not part of the world. And this leads me to the other point that I want to bring to the fore. The clinics, the hospitals, and what it means to actually destroy them in the midst of destroying every possible form of life. Again, the last few days, what we have witnessed over the last 74 days is an intensification of the killing that is quite frightening. It's horror. Not only horror of starvation, but also horror of systematic displacement. The skies that you sometimes look up to are the skies that drop leaflets to tell people move, but move where? Displaced? Okay. Al Shifa Hospital, for the nth time, along with the European hospital, has been bombed last week. And in one of the accounts, and that's another story of creating the archive that I'll get to in a second, we have this description of what happened at Al Shifa. Mahmoud Di, and I'm quoting, and that's from Drop Site, which is one of the news sources. The piece was done by Sharif Abdel Quddus and Jabra. Pardon? Suddenly? Okay, because I moved my head. You see, I have a body and I move my head. Mahmoud Diab, 34, was dragging his wounded brother Ibrahim, 35, on a hospital bed, guiding the rickety wheels over the broken pavement. I couldn't carry him. Deep told Dropside, panting with exhaustions and tear in his eyes. His injuries are severe in the abdomen and legs, his body wrapped in gauze from head to toe. The bed itself became a means of survival. Either we flee with it, or we die together. The bed. Ibrahim was injured by shrapnel in an airstrike that targeted their home in Tal al-Hawa neighborhood a week ago. He trembled in pain and was barely able to speak. But this is what he said. I feel like a living corpse. I thought the hospital was a safe place, but now I'm fleeing from it. A living corpse. The living dead. Achille Mbembe's necropolitics is confronting us. So, is necropolitics, if we wed necropolitics with trauma, what would we get? Can this help us actually get outside of the attempt to redeploy and try to add adjectives and try to add these and posts with post-colonial, decolonial, all that stuff. What actually are we trying to do? And is it time to stop and think, maybe it's a good category, maybe it's not. But let's actually take this moment precisely after Gaza to think about what would that do to our categories of analysis in the relationship to categories of experience. And this takes me to the second point, which is archive, body, and affect. One of the things that I think all of us enjoy tremendously when you read a piece and you think something as you are reading, and then the author of the piece engages you as if mentally we are together. So here we are, affect, archives, and the body and affect. And whom do I see? Henri Bergson, duration, which is, I think, a very important part. Bergson tells us, or he emphasizes the question of duration as lived experience and brings in affect and energy through the body through which we want to think time. And this is, I think, crucial in what we are also dealing with. And that's why really bringing in temporality is a very important aspect. But temporality here is not only the lived time of a massacre, a destruction, loss, but also the time to wait. I mean, how many times do we need to hear, yes, we will get to, we will have a conference in 10 days to discuss a ceasefire in Gaza. 10 days. I'm very bad at math, but how many hours? How many minutes? How many seconds? And does time of 10 days for us sitting here or in the halls of wherever in Qatar actually is the lived experience? Can people who are literally bombed 24/7, starved for 74 days, sustain the notion of in 10 days? What does in 10 days mean if we take seriously the question of moral insult and moral injury and temporality for creating a different archive also that takes the body and time very seriously? Archives by their nature are living in the sense they are made and remade. We revisit them, we go back to them, we constitute them as we are moving through life and moving through some of the most horrifying moments. But we don't create archives also from the same positions, and that's the centrality, I think, that Joelle brings to the fore with regard to the personal and the living body that moves through that. The other part about temporality is not only the lived experience and how we experience time and duration, and the question of time is yet to come, is that we have created also with Gaza, and that what comes through the insult or the rupture, is that as if Gaza represent a time that we can no longer imagine ourselves within. A time that somehow is, we're living here and Gaza lives there. Another time altogether. What do we do with these heterogeneities of times that we are producing as we are also witnessing? And bear witness, as you said several times, is very important. What does this entail in terms of how do we then create possibilities for imagining? I'll take 2 more minutes and then I'll open it to a conversation. So from the living dead, the necropolitics, the crime scene of which the clinic becomes very important, creating a different kind of archive. The body that itself is part of an archive takes me to the last point that I want to engage. How do we write? How can we actually write at these particular moments? And what do we mean by write? Joelle presented us with a very interesting move back and forth between personal experiences and trying to reflect on a larger scene. So that's one way to think about it. We can write with language and through language, but can our language actually help us? Or are we at a particular moment where actually our concepts and terms are in need of different iterations that we feel through our bodies, but somehow there is no way to be able to iterate them yet in terms and categories. We have the language of numbers, which are themselves a moral insult. When we hear that it is with beyond 50,000, 60,000 dead, we don't know the disappeared, we don't know the injured. But then on the other side, we talk about 2 or 3 dead and the horror of the dead and the horror of. What do numbers tell us? And how do numbers speak when we also hear constantly people saying, but we are not numbers, we are lives? So how do we think about numbers and how do we problematize numbers, much as we think about images? So how to write really needs us to revisit the question of and raise questions. What and how do we produce a particular language in order to be able to deal with what we are facing, particularly if we take, and as we take Joelle's notion of dissolution as a very important moment. What does that mean in terms of language? The other thing, and that's where I want to end, is what does this then mean for the third category that is part of the title of this conference, imagination? And how do we write not only through writing as a text that I can read, but how do we write also through all sorts of other means that can bring about the affective body with its languages or silences that cannot actually break through? How do we widen the spectrum through which we can write? And how do we deploy? With whom do we speak? With whom do we think when we write? In Joelle's presentation, we have a sense about we're moving from Greek tragedy mythology to biblical references to after Gaza to psychologists and this whole array. So there is an attempt to try to figure out how do we actually create the interlocutors with whom we think. And maybe there is a sensibility about fragmentation because the world is actually very, very fragmented, but it actually puts also the question on us: how do we and with whom do we think in that particular moment? And calling into question also in the act of how do we write, what are our presumptions and assumptions about the distances that we need to be able to, or we have to create in order for our languages, our texts, our paintings to actually acquire the recognition that they are, quote unquote, somehow not totally immersed. What happens if actually we become totally immersed rather than the averse, and rather than in distance, be there? Thank you.
مشان ترجمة ايه هلا. طيب الوقت تقريبا خلص، بس رح ناخد 10 دقائق لجوال اذا بتسمحي لي ناخد كم سؤال وبتعقبي على الاثنين. حنفتح حناخد كم سؤال لانه ما معنا كثير وقت. في او حدا هون وبعدين لا
أبدأ أنا. السلام عليكم. رح أحكي بالعربي لأنه بتخيل الكل بيفهم علي عربي. اسمي رنا دجاني. أنا Professor of Molecular Biology وبدرس أنا the epigenetics of trauma across generations in humans. السؤال اللي يعني فأنا غريبة على ال disciplines اللي عم تحكوا فيها. فmy observation coming from outside these disciplines إنه هذا العرب Council for Social Science الأودينس عربي اللي عم بيروحوا اللي عم experiencing a trauma عرب yet معلش I'm gonna challenge you. الديسكورس كله Western Judeo-Christian بالanalysis how we deal with it. You're quoting history, theology ما إلها دخل في منطقتنا ومين نحن. فكيف if we're gonna deal with it if we're not talking from our own perspective there's something very missing. وأنا توقعت أسمع إشي منا نحن مش من الويسترن اللي هن خلقوا المشاكل اللي صارت فينا اللي discussed. So that's my comment. Thank you.
شكرا. في حدا هناك وبعدين
Okay, thank you so much for this discussion. I wanted to start off quickly with personal. I want to start with a personal also story and get then to my question. So I'm Egyptian and I live in Germany. We're planning to move back, and I have a kid. And while I prepare her to move back to Egypt, I need to talk to her about, okay, how can she deal with some kind of violations? And my issue is like to get traumatized from kind of sexual harassment or so. And while reading through the stories with her and preparing her, there always comes up two notions, which is either you try to fight back if you can, and if you cannot, or like scream or something, and if you cannot, then run. And the point is that this act of resistance, some kind of resistance, whatever it might be, can help trauma to, like if she gets traumatized through some kind of violation, that she can deal with the situation in a better way, let's say. So it was like, I'm wondering quite a bit, where is resistance? Because of course with destruction comes resistance, and with trauma also, it is not simply, I mean, I wasn't like, I don't want to be, like, I don't know how trauma feels for somebody in Gaza today, but I do also believe that there is something about when we resist in a different way, that it does how it is like, and so I'm wondering also, like, how does this play into dealing with trauma and dealing with destruction and imagination? Thank you so much.
صباح الخير. بدي انطلق من أو أكيد شكراً كتير على يعني فتح الذهن وفتح الترومايات اللي مختزنينها واللي اختزناها كل هالوقت. بدي انطلق من جعل الأمر عادياً، كيف وصلوا ليقدروا يجعلوا الأمر عادياً. وبدي أسأل سؤال الحقيقة، لأنه لطالما خلال فترة الحرب 66 يوم هون بلبنان، خلال السنتين اللي عم نقارب السنتين بغزة، مفهوم التعاطف، فكرة التعاطف مع من نتعاطف، يعني نحن عادة الإنسان اللي بيتعاطف يمكن مع اللي بيشبهه، هيدا على المستوى الفطري، وبدنا نعمل جهد لنتعاطف على المستوى الإنساني وما نثقل هيدا القيمة. هل نحن وصلنا لمرحلة من وراء الكولونيالية إنه نحن نتماهى مع الرجل الأبيض إلى حد إنه نحن صرنا نتعاطف مع ما يشبه الرجل الأبيض، وبالتالي انسلخنا عن إنه نحن نتعاطف مع ذواتنا مع مجتمعاتنا؟ صار حتى عنا مفهوم آخر لوقت اللي نحن منشوف إنسان عم يقتل، ومنشوف إذا نحن فعلياً بيرتفع منسوب التعاطف بحسب الخصائص هيدا الإنسان. إذا مستشفى تقصف، وين هي هالمستشفى؟ فبمجرد ما تكون هي بمكان آخر بتنزل منسوب التعاطف. طبعا هون مش من باب جلد الذات ونحن نرجع كل شيء لنحن نعمله ونقول نحن شو عم نعمل، بس بمحل معين لحظة غزة هيدا التاريخ المكثف ولبنان هيدا بيفتح الاشياء لنقول نحن ويننا من السؤال اللي ده سالته كمان دكتوره حنان، وشو مهمتنا، لانه فعلا نحن عندنا مهام كثير عظيمه على مستوى البناء السيكولوجي والبناء الفكري والبناء المعرفي والبناء الاخلاقي الذاتي لذواتنا كافراد ولمجتمعات. شكرا.
So building on this category of analysis, Dr. Hanan's category of analysis in relation to categories of experience and the discussion of after Gaza, I don't think we're anywhere near after Gaza. We're very much in Gaza. We're in an ongoing genocide and an ongoing resistance to it. And yes, Gaza is a traumatopia, but more importantly, it's a site of genocide that is part of a century of structural violence. You spoke of the horrors of the day, and we all know that that day is in the context of decades of ethnic cleansing. So there's something uncomfortable about removing that structural violence from our discussion about trauma, and I wanted to give you the chance to tell us more about it. How does structural violence actually fit into this category of trauma and traumatopia?
شكرا جوال. أنا طوال يعني محاضرتك كنت استمع إليك وأعود شوي لمقترح كنت مقدمه للمشاركة في المؤتمر، وفي اشتغال على التوبيا، على أساس أنه لما نعود إلى فلسطين حتى خاصة منذ القرن ال19 هي في نفس الوقت موضوع لليوتوبيات، بما في ذلك اليوتوبيا الكبرى للرأسمالية والحداثة إلى آخره، ويوتوبيا للحركة الصهيونية، ولكن في نفس الوقت هي من منظور أصحاب الأرض هي ديستوبيا. فلما نقلب النظرة نصبح يبدو لي في محل يمكننا أكثر من التفكير في اليوتوبيات والديستوبيات من منظور الضحايا. واحد. اثنين، يظهر لي أنه الاشتغال على أنه التوبوس يمكن أن يكون هو نفسه موضوع نظرات مختلفة، فيمكن نقرب أكثر إلى مفاهيم أنت تعرضتي لها شوي، الهيتيروتوبيا، يعني أنه هو مكان ولكنه مكان متعدد، هو مش مكان واحد، هو مكان متعدد في نفس الوقت. طيب أنا اقتراحي أنه ربما نفكروا في غزة الآن. أنا مع الملاحظة الأخيرة الآن بالذات، لأنه ما فيش بعد، نحن في الآن ويجب أن نتعامل مع الآن، ولذلك يجب أن نتعامل معها على أساس أنها ما هيش تروتوبيا، يمكن تكون ريزيستوبيا. نقلب النظرة أصلا يمكن يمكننا هذا من تفكير أوسع. شكرا.
شكرا كثير. جوال مدعوة بكرة الساعة 9 الصبح، معك ساعتين تردي. عم بمزح. إذا بعرف في كثير أسئلة، فإذا فيك تعمل جولة
summary.
لا,
thank you so much for all your reactions, and thank you so much for such a wonderful engagement with the text, I mean, itself, and the proposal. It's a proposal. It's not yet a fully fledged project. It's a conceptualization, and that's what I tried to do. Of course, we are in an ongoing genocide. That's not the point. The point is to anticipate what is after. The first publications that came out after the Holocaust were 20 years later. And that's what I'm trying to anticipate. Since Gaza is such a rupture in the way we understand everything, including, as I was saying, the international humanitarian framework, the way we value lives, and so on. this will have drastic consequences in the traumatic discourse, not today, not tomorrow, in the decades that are coming. So I'm trying to anticipate and try to engage intellectually with that discourse. The Algerians, our Algerian friends, will be very angry if we say that St. Augustine of Hippo is not from Algeria, I suppose. And the Greeks, by the way, were pagans. So it's not, the whole point was to show that, yes, exactly, the traumatic discourse is a Western discourse, but violence, the repercussions of violence, someone mentioned the structures of violence, have repercussions on all of us, regardless of who we are. That's the whole point as well. How to make sense of this discourse and engage with it in a more, as you were suggesting, in a more idiosyncratic manner, in a manner that makes more sense to our part of the world. Epigenetic is also done in the West. We are part of this world. We cannot just divide the world into us and them. I think the whole scientific discourse, in fact, is, I am very skeptical of well-defined, well-delineated Western, non-Western categories. I think there is a lot of appropriation and reappropriation, although it is not acknowledged as such. So that's one point I wanted to say. Yes, on, of course, resistance. Again, I didn't have the chance. This would take another lecture on resistance. There is a term in Arabic, right, sumud. This is how Palestinians themselves have come up with an idiosyncratic way to talk about resilience. Resilience is a Western, is a term that is very much imbued with the history of the Holocaust, in fact. Sumud is an idiosyncratic way of dealing with the traumatic discourse that brings, in fact, that shatters the notion of trauma as like a one-time event. We spoke about temporality, right? And so resilience, sumud, in contrast to resilience, shows that it's an ongoing process. And not only that, it requires a collective effort. Someone mentioned the lack of empathy. That's true, again. And sumud does that. Sumud is not the only indigenous, if you want to call it indigenous concept, or a concept that comes from our part of the world that is challenging the paradigm of resilience today. There is another concept from indigenous Native Americans that the Anishinaabe, native indigenous American author and literary critic, Gerald Visenor, came up with. He talks about survivance, to conceptualize the way in which Native Americans have become invisible in the traumatic discourse and the long-term implications of that violence, that genocidal violence on Native Americans. So yes, of course, this would take us to a different discussion to talk about, sumud or survivance, and in the ways in which these terms are challenging the paradigm of resilience, which is very much imbued with, the traumas of 20th century, in fact, Europe. That's what I was trying to suggest in my proposal. We need new terms to talk about the trauma, this traumatic discourse that will become a reality in the coming decades. That was all, if you want, an intellectual engagement with these issues that are still pending. And I thank the participants for reminding us that it is true, it is ongoing. And that was not the point at all. It was just, a way to frame the abominable. So you were talking, Hanan, of the horror of this moment. How to comprehend the horror of this moment perhaps requires us, because we are intellectuals, to intellectualize the discourse. Perhaps there is no other way to deal with the horror of this moment.
شكرا كثير. يعني بس بالختام، اذا بدنا مثل ما سمعنا من كثير عالم، اذا بدنا نقعد مع بهيدي اللحظه من الفظاعه، ويمكن اذا بنفهم هيدي الفظاعه تحديدا بغزه ولبنان وسوريا واللي عم نشوفه بالمنطقه كمحاوله لتدمير او قتل المستقبل التحرري، فيمكن واجبنا كمان التفكير بأساليب الصمود والمقاومة والبقاء وتخيل مستقبل أفضل للمنطقة وللعالم كله. شكرا جزيلا لكل اللي حضروا و ثانك يو. في 7 دقائق بقوا من البريك وبعدين ببلشوا الجلسات الثانيين. شكرا.